Game theory is a foundational exploration of strategic decision-making, examining how individuals, businesses, and governments make choices when the outcomes depend not only on their own actions, but also on the actions of others. At its core, the book introduces concepts like the prisoner's dilemma, Nash equilibrium, zero-sum games, cooperative versus non-cooperative games, and more. Through mathematical logic and real-world examples from economics and politics to biology and everyday life, it shows how game theory helps explain competition, collaboration, conflict, and negotiation. It's a guide to understanding how strategy works in a world full of interdependent decisions. About the author, John von Neumann and Oskar Morgenstern. The original book, Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, was co-authored by John von Neumann, a mathematical genius widely regarded as one of the fathers of modern computing, and Oskar Morgenstern, an Austrian economist known for bridging economic theory with rigorous mathematical analysis. Von Neumann brought deep mathematical insight, especially in logic and probability, while Morgenstern contributed economic understanding and practical grounding. Together, their work laid the formal groundwork for what we now call game theory, shaping fields as diverse as economics, military strategy, evolutionary biology, and behavioral science. Once upon a time, in a world not too different from our own, people found themselves constantly making choices. Some choices were simple: what to eat for lunch or which road to take home. But others were far more complex, especially when those choices affected or were affected by the choices of others. Whether it was kings deciding whether to make peace or go to war, businesses setting prices to outdo each other, or even animals competing for food in the wild, it all boiled down to one thing: strategy. Now, imagine if there was a magical map that could help predict what people might do in these situations, not based on guesswork or emotions, but through logic, numbers, and the quiet power of reason. That's where the story of game theory begins. In a quiet room filled with chalk dust and equations, two brilliant minds, John and Oskar, began weaving a world where decisions were games, and players made their moves not with dice, but with purpose. They believed that every situation involving more than one person with different interests could be thought of like a game, and not the kind with plastic tokens or colorful boards, but the kind that lives in the choices we make when we're trying to win, avoid loss, or simply get by. They started by imagining a simple kind of game one where two players compete, and what one gains, the other loses. This was the world of zero-sum games. Picture two generals on a battlefield. One's victory is the other's defeat. One gains territory. The other loses it. These games were intense, but they were clear-cut. There was no sharing, no in-between. You either won or you didn't. But what if these generals weren't just firing cannons? What if they could outsmart each other by bluffing, misdirecting, or secretly allying with others? That's when things became far more interesting. You see, game theory wasn't just about brute strength. It was about outthinking your opponent. And in some cases, it was about knowing when not to fight at all. John and Oskar gave players something powerful: the ability to model their opponent's mind. If you could guess what the other player would do, you could plan your own move accordingly. But it wasn't easy. Sometimes both players would sit still, staring at each other, unsure of who would blink first. These situations had a name: equilibria. a moment where no one had anything to gain by changing their choice, assuming the other stayed the same. As John worked through pages of equations, he discovered something extraordinary. In many games, even when the rules were complex, there was always a point of balance. This was the magic of the Minimax theorem, which showed that even in the most cutthroat of games, there was always a strategy that could minimize your worst-case loss. It wasn't about always winning, but about never losing too badly. That made survival in the strategic jungle possible. Back in the world of kings and merchants, these ideas took shape in all sorts of ways. A merchant pricing his goods had to think not just about his costs, but also about what his rivals might do. Would they drop their prices and undercut him? Would they team up and raise prices together? It was a dance, and everyone was watching everyone else's feet, trying to anticipate the next move. But here's where things got truly fascinating. Some games weren't about winning at someone else's expense. Some were about working together. Imagine two travelers caught in a storm. They could either build a shelter together or go it alone. If they both chose to help, they'd be safe and warm. But if one refused, the other would suffer, doing all the work. These situations required trust, and game theory could explain why trust sometimes bloomed and why it sometimes withered. In these cooperative games, alliances could form, but they were fragile. People would weigh the benefits of sticking together against the temptation of going solo and grabbing a bigger share of the reward. And that's where bargaining came in. Who gets what? How do we split the treasure fairly? Game theory helped answer that too, showing that fairness often depended not just on what was deserved, but on what was possible. Meanwhile, back in the world of abstract logic, John and Oskar began asking deeper questions. What if a game had more than two players? What if players could form coalitions, whisper in corners, and promise favors in exchange for support? This led to the birth of coalition games, where the strength of your position wasn't just about your own power, but about the strength of your allies. But even as these ideas grew, the real heart of game theory was always the same: understanding how people make choices when they don't have complete control over the outcome. It was about predicting behavior, not forcing it. It was about realizing that even in chaos, there could be patterns, and that those patterns could be used to make smarter decisions. In one corner of their work, they explored situations where players had complete information. Everyone knew the rules, the payoffs, and each other's strategies. These were games of perfect information like chess. Every move was visible. Every possibility was open. The real challenge was thinking far enough ahead. But most of the world didn't work like that. Most of the time, people made decisions in the dark. They didn't know what others would do, or even what others wanted. These were games of incomplete information. Like poker, where a smirk or a raised eyebrow could be a weapon just as sharp as a card. Game theory helped players make the best decisions they could with the information they had, using probabilities and expectations as their guide. As night fell over their chalkboards and notebooks, John and Oskar's ideas kept growing. They had opened a door into the hidden logic of human interaction. Every deal, every negotiation, every silent standoff now had a structure beneath it. And though the mathematics behind their work could be dense, the story it told was deeply human. It was a story of competition and cooperation, of trust and betrayal, of reason battling impulse. And at the heart of it all was a simple question: what should I do when what I do depends on what you do? The answer, as game theory showed, wasn't always easy, but it was often clear. And with that, the first part of the story ends not with a conclusion, but with a doorway to deeper realms. Because in the next chapter, the games get more tangled, the players more varied, and the choices more subtle. Part 2. The quiet room where John and Oskar worked became a place of wonder, where ideas unfolded like the petals of a flower touched by morning sun. The further they explored this strange world of strategic thinking, the more they realized it wasn't just a mathematical theory, it was a mirror to human nature. Every game, every choice, every hesitation revealed something about how people behaved when they weren't alone. They now turned their attention to the idea of dominance. Imagine two players, each choosing between several possible moves. One of them quickly realizes that no matter what the opponent does, one of her choices always gives her better results. That's what they called a dominant strategy. It's like having a magical sword in your hand, stronger, faster, and more reliable than anything else. If you've got one, you use it. And if your opponent has one, you'd better hope you're not in the way. But not all choices were that simple. Sometimes there was no clearly dominant move. Sometimes each choice had a risk. One decision might bring a big reward or a huge loss. Another might feel safer, more stable, but offer less. That's when players had to weigh their options and think like fortune tellers, trying to guess what the other side might do. One of the most famous puzzles that emerged from their world was about two people caught in a bind. They'd done something wrong. Let's say they were caught sneaking cookies from the king's pantry, and now they sat in separate cells. The guards came in and gave them each a tempting offer. "Confess and betray your partner," they said, "and you might go free. But if you stay silent and your partner betrays you, you'll be punished harshly. If you both stay silent, you'll only get a little punishment. But if you both betray each other, you'll both suffer." This, as John and Oskar described, was a prisoner's dilemma. It was a game of trust, fear, and second-guessing. If both players were loyal, they'd be better off. But because each feared betrayal, they often chose to betray first, protecting themselves but ruining the outcome. It was a sad kind of logic, one where the best outcome was sacrificed because of mutual suspicion. This kind of dilemma didn't just exist in fairy tale prisons. It echoed in business, politics, even among friends. Two companies could agree not to lower their prices and keep profits high. But if one secretly dropped prices to steal customers, it might win big unless the other did the same. Then both would lose. It was a delicate balance, and game theory laid bare the tension that lived in every unspoken agreement. As John traced these patterns, he realized that many games didn't have simple solutions. Instead of one perfect move, players had to rely on mixed strategies. It was like flipping a coin, only smarter. Instead of always choosing the same move, a player might randomize, keeping their opponent off guard. One time they might play aggressive, another time cautious. It wasn't about being unpredictable for the sake of chaos. It was about making sure the other side couldn't take advantage. Mixed strategies made even the trickiest games fairer. Imagine a goalkeeper trying to block a penalty kick. The striker could shoot left or right. The goalie had to guess. If either always did the same thing, they'd lose. But if they mixed it up, if they became unreadable, the balance returned. Game theory captured this tension in elegant curves and tidy equations, but the meaning ran deeper. It was about adaptation, about never letting yourself become too easy to beat. As the story continued, John and Oskar ventured into cooperative territory, again, where alliances and promises ruled. Here they introduced something called the core. Imagine a group of people pooling their efforts to earn rewards. They could split the prize many ways, but if a smaller group could break off and get more for themselves, the alliance would crumble. The core was the set of splits where no one had a reason to leave. It was a kind of peace treaty. Everyone stayed because they were getting enough. The problem, of course, was that the core didn't always exist. Some games just couldn't be made fair for everyone. Someone always felt cheated, and that led to instability. John and Oskar weren't offering fairy tale endings. They were offering clarity, showing when peace was possible and when tension was built into the game itself. As if this weren't enough, they also tackled the idea of fairness in bargaining. When two people had to divide something, land, gold, or even time, what counted as fair? Sometimes fairness came from equality. Other times it came from power. If one person had more to offer or more to threaten with, they could demand a larger share. But if both had equal strength, the fairest split might be right down the middle. Game theory provided tools to understand these deals. It looked at what each person could get on their own and compared that to what they could gain by working together. If the joint reward was bigger, it made sense to collaborate, but only if each got more than they could alone. And so bargaining became a dance between need and leverage, desire and compromise. There was also something deeply poetic about the way John and Oskar framed uncertainty. In real life, players rarely knew everything. They had guesses, hopes, and bits of information, but never the full picture. That's why they introduced games with incomplete information. Imagine playing cards with your hand hidden, only able to guess what others held. The beauty of game theory was that even here, with shadows and secrets, you could still make smart choices. In fact, sometimes the smartest players didn't try to win every hand, they tried to signal. They might fold a strong hand to trick their opponent later, or raise the stakes with nothing just to project strength. These subtle moves weren't bluffs in the traditional sense. They were strategic plays meant to influence what others believed, and it wasn't just individuals making choices. Game theory stretched its wings to study large groups, entire markets, nations, and species. In nature, animals competed for food, mates, and safety. Some fought, others cooperated. Game theory even reached into biology, explaining why some species evolved to share, while others didn't. The logic of the jungle followed the same patterns as a boardroom meeting or a card game at dusk. As the sun began to set over their world of logic and numbers, John and Oskar realized they had done more than create a theory. They had uncovered a language for decision-making, a grammar of strategy, built from assumptions, expectations, and calculated risks. Their work would go on to inspire generals, economists, biologists, and psychologists. But more than that, it would help people understand each other. Because beneath all the equations, the story of game theory was a story about us. About how we try to win, avoid loss, build trust, and sometimes outsmart one another, not because we're cruel or clever, but because we're trying to survive in a world where every choice affects someone else. As the stars glimmered above their quiet world of logic, John and Oskar found themselves delving deeper into the mysteries of interaction. Not the obvious ones, but those subtle moments where silence speaks louder than words and hesitation carries weight. The deeper they went, the more they realized that strategy didn't just belong to battlefields and business rooms. It lived in dinner-table conversations, in the shuffling of feet before a first kiss, in the delicate tension between cooperation and betrayal. They began to explore how people handled games not just with different actions, but with different knowledge. In some games, everyone knew the rules and the players, the possible moves and the rewards. But life often didn't work like that. Sometimes players didn't even know who else was playing or what the prize really was. These were games of incomplete information, and they were as close to real life as the tick of a clock. To understand these murkier waters, they introduced something called Bayesian games. In these games, each player had a type, a hidden character trait or secret bit of knowledge only they knew. Maybe one player was brave while the other was cautious. Maybe one had extra information the other didn't. The challenge was to act not just based on what you saw, but what you believed about the unseen. Imagine you're bidding in an auction, and you don't know how much the painting is really worth to the other bidders. You make your best guess based on the way they fidget, how quickly they raise their hands, or how still they sit. You form beliefs, and then you act. Game theory helped players update those beliefs as they saw new actions, learning, adjusting, predicting again. This process of belief and revision was delicate. It required not just logic, but the ability to think about someone else's thinking. What do they think I know? What do they think I'll do? And if they expect that, should I surprise them or let them believe they've outsmarted me? It was a beautiful, twisting mirror of the mind, and game theory handed players the tools to look into it without getting lost. John and Oskar's ideas soon reached beyond games played once in a single moment. They imagined what happened when games repeated, when players met again and again, like merchants trading in the same market or villagers sharing the same well. Here, behavior changed. Players who might betray in a one-time game learned to cooperate when they knew there would be a tomorrow. This was the power of repetition. When the future mattered, trust could grow. A player who cheated today might lose allies tomorrow. A player who forgave today might earn loyalty in the long run. Strategies like tit for tat, where players mirrored each other's last move, began to shine. They were simple but effective. Kindness was met with kindness. Betrayal was met with defense. It was a logic that echoed through human relationships, one that whispered, "Treat others well, and they just might treat you the same." The elegance of repeated games was that they offered space for reputation. A player's history mattered. Others watched, remembered, and judged, and this memory shaped the future. John and Oskar marveled at how such simple structures could model real societies, where gossip and goodwill were just as powerful as gold. In the shadows of this growing world, they also studied threats and promises. In many games, players didn't just act, they spoke. They made threats. "If you do this, I'll do that." Or promises. "Work with me and I'll share the reward." But words were only as strong as the actions behind them. Game theory taught that for a threat to work, it had to be credible. A bluff could backfire if the opponent called it. So they asked, when is a threat believable? When does a promise hold weight? The answer was simple, yet profound. Only when the player has a reason to follow through. This was where commitment came into play. Sometimes a player could tie their own hands, making it impossible to back down later. Like a captain burning the ships so his soldiers have no choice but to win. Commitment turned soft words into solid ground. And in that, game theory uncovered the strength of resolve. They also looked at coordination. Not every game was about clashing interests. Sometimes players wanted the same thing but didn't know how to get there together. Imagine two travelers in a dark forest trying to find each other. They both want to meet, but where? This is the world of coordination games. The challenge isn't conflict, but confusion. Success lies in choosing the same thing at the same time, even without communication. This kind of game whispered truths about social norms and unspoken rules. Why do we all drive on the same side of the road? Why do people follow cues, wear similar clothes, or nod when they agree? Coordination, not command, keeps society running. Game theory showed that often the solution wasn't the best choice in theory, but the one everyone expected others to choose. That's how conventions were born, not from rules, but from shared belief. As they moved through these ideas, John and Oskar realized something quietly breathtaking. Their theory didn't just model games, it modeled choice itself. It revealed how people think when stakes are high and certainty is low, how they weigh loyalty against reward, pride against peace, and risk against hope. Their ideas wandered into economics, where entire markets danced to the rhythm of competition. Buyers and sellers, employers and workers, each acting in their own interest, created a system that surprisingly could still work for everyone, at least in theory. Here, game theory became a compass, helping economists understand how prices were set, why markets sometimes failed, and what might be done to guide them toward fairness. In politics, the theory turned to voting systems and elections. Different methods of counting votes led to different winners, even when the voters stayed the same. Coalitions formed, broke apart, and formed again. Game theory offered insight into these political dances, showing why certain systems led to gridlock and others to compromise. Even in war, where lives hung in the balance, game theory played a role. During tense moments in history, it helped world leaders think through the logic of deterrence. The idea was chilling but clear. If both sides could destroy each other, neither would dare to strike first. This was the cold calculation of mutually assured destruction, a strategy not for winning, but for preventing war in the first place. It was a grim kind of peace, but peace nonetheless. Back in the quiet room with their notebooks and pencils, John and Oskar watched as their ideas rippled outward, touching fields they hadn't even imagined. Their theory had grown from a handful of equations into a map for human behavior. And though its roots were mathematical, its branches reached into the soul. They knew, of course, that not every choice could be modeled. People were not always rational. Emotions stirred the waters. Pride, love, fear, guilt, these didn't fit neatly into formulas. But even then, game theory offered something gentle and wise, a way to ask better questions. Why did someone make that choice? What might they have believed? What were they afraid of losing? And so their story carried on. not as a tale of perfect answers, but as a guide to thoughtful inquiry. A story about seeing the world not as random chaos, but as a vast game board, where every piece has a reason, every move a meaning. As the night deepened and the stars blinked overhead, their theory whispered softly into the world, helping people understand not just each other, but themselves. In the final stretch of their quiet and profound journey, John and Oskar began to reflect on what their theory truly meant. It had started as a way to study economic behavior, a tool to bring precision and clarity to markets and decisions. But what it became was something far greater, a philosophy of strategy, a bridge between mathematics and human nature, a lantern shining softly into the dark corners of choice. They had already mapped out how two players could face off, how groups could form alliances, how decisions might change when the same players met again, and how knowledge or the lack of it could shape everything. But as their understanding grew deeper, so did their questions. They began to wonder about fairness, not the kind found in laws or written codes, but a deeper, subtler fairness, the kind people feel in their bones. Why do some people accept unequal deals while others walk away from even slightly unfair ones? How do we define what's just, especially when every person has their own measure? They looked to solution concepts tools meant to help players figure out what should happen in a game. One of these, the Nash equilibrium, had grown from their earliest work and blossomed into a guiding star. It said that in many situations, players settle into a pattern where no one wants to change their choice because doing so would only make things worse. It wasn't always the best possible outcome, but it was stable. No regrets, no second-guessing. But even this had its limits. In some games there were many equilibria, in others none at all. And so John and Oskar, and those who followed in their footsteps, asked, could there be a rule that picked the fairest or most rational outcome from a set of possibilities? This led them to explore refinement's ways to filter and narrow the results, to separate the plausible from the absurd. Each refinement peeled away a layer of noise, bringing players closer to clarity. But the truth was there was no one-size-fits-all answer. Different games needed different lenses. Fairness, like beauty, sometimes lived in the eye of the beholder. Even so, there were moments of stunning precision. In bargaining games, especially ones where players took turns making offers, game theory could predict exactly what share each would accept down to the last coin. The magic was in the structure, the time limits, the power of the first move, the cost of delay. It all mattered. Change one tiny rule, and the outcome could swing dramatically. As John and Oskar watched this theory evolve, they saw it growing into something flexible and elegant. It could explain fierce competition or tender cooperation. It could illuminate the cold brinkmanship of international politics or the simple sharing of candy between two children. The form changed, but the heart of it remained the same. Players with choices, locked in a web of interdependence. And so the theory moved further, touching new lands. In evolutionary biology, it explained why certain traits survived. Creatures that cooperated might thrive unless they were taken advantage of. Then selfishness might grow until enough cooperation disappeared and mutual benefit became scarce. The theory described these cycles with a quiet, surprising beauty. Even in nature, it seemed, the logic of games played out across generations. In psychology, it helped explain human behavior that didn't always seem rational. People didn't just want to win. They wanted to punish cheaters, reward kindness, avoid guilt, and feel pride. Even these emotions, so rich and layered, had strategic roles. People cared about reputation. They remembered past slights. They built trust slowly and broke it quickly. Game theory didn't erase these complexities. It gave them context. It even reached into computer science. In a world of algorithms and artificial intelligence, where machines began to make decisions on our behalf, game theory offered a guide. How should self-driving cars navigate intersections? How should auctions be designed for internet ads? How can distributed systems make fair choices when no one has full control? The answers, again and again, came from this same foundation: strategic thinking under uncertainty. And through all this, the story returned to something simple, almost poetic. The idea that we are not alone in our decisions, that every move we make echoes outward, that our success, failure, joy, and pain are tied not just to what we do, but to what others do too. In a way, game theory was never just about games. It was about life, about understanding the quiet tension in a handshake, the pause before a deal is signed, the hesitation before saying yes or no. It gave language to those invisible forces that shape our world, not the rules we see, but the expectations, assumptions, and silent calculations beneath the surface. John and Oskar had built something remarkable, not because it answered every question, but because it offered a way to ask them, a way to think clearly, to look at complex problems, and find the structure within. They didn't claim their theory could solve every dilemma or prevent every conflict, but they believed it could help people understand one another just a little better. And that, perhaps, was the real gift. So now, as our story winds to a close, imagine the world through the eyes of game theory, a world where every choice carries a ripple, where trust is earned through consistency and threats only work when they cost something, a world where silence can speak volumes, and where the smartest move isn't always the boldest, but often the most thoughtful. In this world, we are all players. We all carry pieces of the puzzle, reacting, responding, adjusting to what others do. Sometimes we compete. Sometimes we cooperate. Sometimes we bluff. But at our best, we learn the rhythm of the game we're in, and we play with wisdom, with care, and with a touch of grace. And so, in the end, the story of game theory is not just the story of mathematics or economics. It's the story of people, of how we try to get along, how we wrestle with choice, how we search for balance. It is a story of minds meeting minds, of strategy, of humanity laid bare. And now, with that final thought, the lights dim, the equations settle like dust on the page, and the quiet world John and Oskar built folds gently into dreams. The end. And that wraps up our journey through the fascinating world of game theory, a world where every choice counts, every player matters, and strategy is everything. If you enjoyed this storytelling approach to one of the most powerful ideas in modern thinking, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another deep dive into the books that shape our world.